The Geographical Pivot of History, a speech held by Mr. Halford Mackinder at the Royal Geographical Society, January 25, 1904. When historians in the remote future come to look back on the group of centuries through which we are now passing and see them foreshortened, as we today see the Egyptian dynasties, it may well be that they will describe the last 400 years as the Columbian epoch, and will say that it ended soon after the year 1900. Of late, it has been a commonplace to speak of geographical exploration as nearly over, and it is recognized that geography must be diverted to the purpose of intensive survey and philosophic synthesis. In 400 years, the outline of a map of the world has been completed with approximate accuracy, and even in the polar regions, the voyages of Nansen and Scott have very narrowly reduced the last possibility of dramatic discoveries. But the opening of the 20th century is appropriate as the end of a great historic epoch, not merely on account of this achievement, great though it be. The missionary, the conqueror, the farmer, the miner, and of late the engineer have followed so closely in the traveller's footstep that the world, in its remote borders, has hardly been revealed before. We must chronicle its virtually complete political appropriation. In Europe, North America, South America, Africa, and Australasia, there is scarcely region left for the pegging out of a claim of ownership, unless as a result of a war between civilized or half-civilized powers. Even in Asia, we are probably witnessing the last lose of a game, first played by the horsemen of Jamak the Cossack and the shipmen of Vasco da Gama. Broadly speaking, we may contrast the Columbian epoch with the age which preceded it, by describing its essential characteristic as the expansion of Europe against almost negligible resistance. Whereas medieval Christendom was pent into a narrow region and threatened by external barbarism. From the present time forth, in the post-Columbian age, we shall again have to deal with a closed political system, and nonetheless that it will be one of worldwide scope. Heavy explosion of social forces, instead of being dissipated in a surrounding circuit of unknown space and barbaric chaos, will be sharply re-echoed from the far side of the globe, and weak elements in the political and economic organism of the world will be shattered in consequence. There is a vast difference of fact in the fall of shell into an earthwork, in its fall amid the closed space and rigid structures of a great building or ship. Probably some half-consciousness of this fact is what lies diverting much of the attention of statesmen in all parts of the world from territorial expansion to a struggle for relative efficiency. It appears to me, therefore, that in the present decade we are for the first time in a position of attempt, with some degree of completeness, a correlation between the larger geographical and the larger historical generalizations. For the first time, we can perceive something of the real proportions of features and events on the stage of the whole world, and may seek a formula which shall express certain aspects, at any rate, of geographical causation in universal history. If we are fortunate, that formula should have a practical value as setting into perspective some of the competing forces in current international politics. The familiar phrase about the westward march of empire is an empirical and fragmentary attempt of a kind. I propose this evening describing those physical features of the world which I believe to have been most coercive of human action, and presenting some of the chief phases of history as organically connected with them, even in the ages when they were unknown to geography. My aim will not be to discuss the influence of this or that kind of feature, or yet to make a study in regional geography. but rather to exhibit human history as part of a life of a world organism. I recognize that I can only arrive at one aspect of the truth, and I have no wish to stray into excessive materialism. Man and not nature initiates, but nature in large measure controls. My concern is with a general physical control, rather with the cause of universal history. It is obvious that only a first approximation to truth can be hoped for. I shall be humble to my critics. The late Professor Freeman held that the only history which counts is that of the Mediterranean and European races. In a sense, of course, this is true, for it is among these races that have originated the ideas which have rendered the inheritors of Greece and Rome dominant throughout the world. In another and very important sense, however, such a limitation has a cramping effect upon thought. The ideas which go to form a nation as opposed to a mere crowd of human animals have usually been accepted under the pressure of a common regulation and under a common necessity of resistance to external force. The idea of England was beaten into the heptarchy by Danish and Norman conquerors. The idea of France was forced upon competing Franks, Goths, and Romans by the Huns at Chalons. And in the 100 Years' War with England, the idea of Christendom was born of the Roman persecutions and matured by the Crusades. The idea of the United States was accepted and local colonial patriotism sunk only in the long War of Independence. The idea of the German Empire was reluctantly adopted in South Germany, only after a struggle against France and comradeship with North Germany. What I may describe as a literary concoction of history, by concentrating attention upon ideas and upon the civilization, which is their outcome, is apt to lose sight of a more elemental movements, which pressure in commonly the existing cause of the effects in which great ideas are nourished. A repellent personality performs a valuable social function in uniting his enemies. It was under the pressure of external barbarism that Europe achieved her civilization. I ask you, therefore, for a moment, to look upon Europe and European civil history as a subordinate to Asia and Asiatic history. For European civilization is, in a very real sense, the outcome of a secular struggle against Asiatic invasion. The most remarkable contrast in the political map of modern Europe is that presented by the vast area of Russia occupying half the continent and the group of smaller territories tenanted by the Western powers. From a physical point of view, there is, of course, a like contrast between the unbroken lowland of the east and the rich complex of mountains and valleys, islands and peninsula, which together form the remainder of this part of the world. At first sight, it would appear that in these familiar facts we have a correlation between natural environment and political organization, so obvious as hardly to be worth of description, especially when we know that throughout the Russian plain a cold winter is opposed to a hot summer, and the conditions of human existence thus rendered additionally uniform. Yet a series of historical maps, such as that contained in the Oxford Atlas, reveal the fact that not merely is the rough coincidence of European Russia with the eastern plain of Europe a matter of the last 100 years or so, but that in all earlier time there was persistence to the assertion of quite another tendency in the political regrouping. Two groups of states usually divided the country into northern and southern political systems. The fact is that the orographical map does not express a particular physical contrast, which has until very lately controlled human movement and settlement in Russia. When the screen of winter snow fades northward off the vast face of the plain, it is followed by rains, whose maximum occurs in May and June, besides the Black Sea. But near the Baltic and White Seas it is deferred to July and August. In the south, the late summer is a period of drought. As a consequence of this climatic regime, the north and northwest were forest broken, only by marshes, where the south and southeast were boundless grassy steppe, with trees only along the rivers. The line separating the two regions came diagonally northeastwards from the northern end of the Carpathians to the point of the Ural range near to its southern, then to its northern extremity. Moscow lies a little to north of this line, or, in other words, on the forest side of it. Outside Russia, the boundary of the Great Forest ran westward almost exactly through the center of European Isthmus, which is 800 miles across between the Baltic and the Black Seas. Beyond this, in peninsular Europe, the woods spread on throughout the plains of Germany in the north, while the steppe lands in the south turned the grey Transylvanian bastion of the Carpathians and extend up the Danube, for there are now the cornfields of Romania to the Iron Gates. A detached area of steppes, known locally as pustas, now largely cultivated, occupied the plain of Hungary, ingrid by the forested rim of Carpathians and Alpine mountains. In all the west of Russia, save in the far north, the clearing of a forest, the drainage of the marshes, and then driven across the of steppes have recently avenged the character of a landscape, in large measures obliterated a distinction which was formerly a very coercive of humanity. The earlier Russia and Poland were established wholly in the glades of the forest. Through the steppe, on the other hand, they came from the unknown recesses of Asia, by the gateway between the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea. In all the centuries, from the 5th to the 6th centuries, a remarkable succession of Turanian nomadic people, Huns, Avars, Bulgarians, Magyars, Khazars, Patsinaks, Cumans, Mongols, Kalmucks, under Attila the Hun, established himself in the midst of the Pustas, in the uttermost Danubian outlier of the steppes, and thence dealt blows northward, westward, and southward against the settled peoples of Europe. A large part of modern history might be written as a commentary upon the change directly or indirectly ensuing from these raids. The Angles and Saxons, it is quite possible, were then driven to cross the seas to found England and Britain. The Franks, the Goths, and the Roman provincials were compelled, for the first time, to stand shoulder to shoulder on the battlefield of Chalons, making common cause against the Asiatics, who were unconsciously welding together modern France. Venice was founded from the destruction of Aquileia and Padua, and even the papacy owed a decisive prestige to a successful meditation of Pope Leo of Attila at Milan. Such was the harvest of results produced by a cloud of ruthlessness and idealist horsemen sweeping over the unimpeded plain. A blow, as it were, from the great Asiatic hammer, striking freely through the vacant space. The Huns were followed by the Avars. It was for the marchland against these that Austria was founded, and Vienna fortified, as a result of the campaigns of Charlemagne. The Magyar came next, and by incessant raiding from a steppe base in Hungary, increased the significance of the Austrian outpost, so drawing the political focus of Germany eastward to the margin of the realm. The Bulgarian established a ruling caste south of the Danube, and was left his name upon the map, although his language has yielded to that of his Slavonic subjects. Perhaps the longest and most effective occupation of the Russian steppe proper was that of the Khazars, who were contemporaries of a great Saracen movement. The Arab geographers knew the Caspian as the Khazar Sea. In the end, however, new hordes arrived from Mongolia, and for 2 centuries Russia in the northern forest was held tributary to the Mongol Khans of Kipchak, or the steppe. And Russian development was thus delayed and biased at a time when the remainder of Europe was rapidly advancing. It should be noted that the rivers running from the forest to the Black and Caspian Sea across the whole breadth of the steppe land, path of the nomads, and that from time to time were transition movements along the courses at right angles to the movement of the horsemen. Thus the missionaries of Greek Christianity ascended the Dnieper to Kiev, just as beforehand the North Varangians had ascended the same river on the way to Constantinople. Still earlier, the Teutonic Goths appear for a moment upon the Dniester, having crossed Europe from the shores of the Baltic in the same south-eastward direction. But these are passing episodes, which do not invalidate the broader generalization. For 1,000 years a series of horse-riding peoples emerged from Asia through the broad interval between the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea, rode through the open spaces of southern Russia, and struck home into Hungary, in the very heart of the European peninsula, shaping by the necessity of opposing them the history of each of the great peoples around, the Russians, the Germans, the French, the Italians, and the Byzantine Greeks. That they stimulated healthy and powerful reaction, instead of crushing opposition under a widespread despotism, was due to the fact that the nobility of their power was conditioned by the steppes and necessarily seized in the surrounding forests and mountains. A rival nobility of power was that of the Vikings in the boats, descending from Scandinavia upon both the northern and southern shores of Europe. They penetrated inland by the riverways. But the scope of their action was limited, for broadly speaking their power was affected only in the neighborhood of the water. Thus the settled people of Europe lay gripped between two pressures, that of the Asiatic nomads from the east, and on the other three sides that of pirates from the sea. From its very nature neither pressure was overwhelming, and both therefore were stimulative. It was noteworthy that the formative influence of the Scandinavians was second only in significance to that of the nomads, for under their attacks both England and France made long moves towards unity, while the unity of Italy was broken by them. In earlier times Rome had mobilized the power of her settled peoples by means of her roads. The Romans' roads had fallen into decay, and they were not replaced until the 18th century. It is likely that even the Hunnish invasion was by no means the first of the Asiatic series. The Scythians of Homeric and Herodotian accounts, drinking the milk of mares, obviously praised the same arts of life, and were probably of the same race as the later inhabitants of the steppe. The Celtic elements in the river names, Don, Donets, Dnieper, Dniester, and Danube, may possibly betoken the passage of peoples of similar habits, who not of identical race, but it is not unlikely that the Celts came merely from the northern forests, like the Goths and Thuringians of a later time. The great wedge of population, however, which the anthropologists characterize as Brachycephalic, driven westward from Brachycephalic Asia through Central Europe into France, is apparently intrusive between the northern, western, and southern Dolichocephalic populations, and may very probably have been derived from Asia. The full meaning of Asiatic influence upon Europe is not, however, discernible until we come to the Mongol invasions of the 15th century. But before we analyze the essential facts concerning these, it is desirable to shift our geographical viewpoint from Europe, so that we may consider the Old World in its entirety. It is obvious that, since the rainfall it derived from the sea, the heart of the greatest landmass is likely to be relatively dry. We are not, therefore, surprised to find that 2/3 of all the world's population is concentrated in relatively small areas along the margins of a great continent. In Europe, besides the Atlantic Ocean, in the Indies and China, besides the Indian and Pacific Ocean. A vast belt of almost inhabited, because practically rainless and land, extends the Sahara completely across northern Africa into Arabia. Central and southern Africa were almost as completely severed from Europe and Asia throughout a great part of history as were the Americans and Australia. In fact, the southern boundary of Europe was and is the Sahara rather than the Mediterranean, for it is the desert which divides the black man from the white. The continuous land masses of Eurasia, thus included between the ocean and the desert, measures 21 million square miles, or half of all the land on the globe, if we exclude from reckoning the deserts of Sahara and Arabia. There are many detached deserts scattered through Asia, from Syria and Persia, northeastward to Manchuria, but no such continuous vacancy as to be comparable to the Sahara. On the other hand, Eurasia is characterized by a very remarkable distribution of river drainage. Throughout an immense portion of the center north, the rivers have practically useless for purpose of human communication with the outer world. The Volga, the Oxus, and the Yaxartes drain into salt lakes. The Obi, the Yenisei, and the Lena into the frozen ocean of the north. These are 6 of the greatest rivers in the world. There are many smaller but still considerable streams in the same area, such as the Tarim and the Helmand, which similarly fail to reach the ocean. Thus the core of Eurasia, although mottled with desert patches, is on the wholly a steppe land, supplying a widespread, if often scanty pasture, and there are not a few river-fed oases in it, but it's wholly unpenetrated by waterways from the ocean. In other words, we have in this immense area all the conditions for maintenance of sparse, but in the aggregate considerable population of horse-riding and camel-riding nomads. The realm is limited northward by the broad belt of subarctic forest and marsh, wherein the climate is too rigorous, except at the eastern and western extremities, for the development of agricultural settlement. In the east, the forces extend southward to the Pacific coast in Amur Island and Manchuria. Similarly, in the west, in prehistoric Europe, forest was a predominant vegetation. Thus framed it into the northeast, north, and northwest, the steppes were continuously for 4,000 miles from the Pustas of Hungary to the little Gobi of Manchuria, and except in the westernmost extremity, they are untraversed by rivers draining to an accessible ocean, but we may neglect the very recent efforts to trade on the mouths of the Obi and the Yenisei. In Europe, western Siberia, and western Turkestan, the steppe land lie low, in some places below the level of the sea. Further to east, in Mongolia, they extend over a plateau, but the passage from the one level to the other over the naked, unscraped lower ranges of the arid heartland presents little difficulty. The hordes which ultimately fell upon Europe in the middle of the 14th century gathered for their first force 300 miles away in the high steppes of Mongolia. The havoc wrought for a few years in Poland, Silesia, Moravia, Hungary, Croatia, and Serbia was, however, but the remotest and most transient result of a great stirring of the nomads in the east, associated with the name of Genghis Khan. While the Golden Horde occupied the steppe of Kipchak from the Sea of Aral through the interval between the Ural Range and the Caspian to the foot of the Carpathians, another horde descending southwestwards between the Caspian Sea and the Hindu Kush into Persia, Mesopotamia, and even to Syria, founded the domain of the Ilkhan. A third subsequent struck into northern China, conquering Cathay, India, and Mangi, or southern China, were for a time sheltered by the incomparable barrier of Tibet. To whose efficiency there is, perhaps, nothing similar in the world, unless it be the Sahara Desert and the polar ice. But at the later time, in the days of Marco Polo, in the case of Mangi, in those of Tamerlane, in the case of India, the obstacle was circumvented. Thus it happened that in this typical and well-recorded instance, all the settled margins of the Old World sooner or later felt the expansive force of mobility and power originating in the steppe. Russia, Persia, India, and China were either made tributary or received Mongol dynasties. Even the incipient power of the Turks in Asia Minor was struck down for half a century. As in the case of Europe, so in the other martial lands of Eurasia, were records of earlier invasions. China had more than once to submit to conquest from the north, India several times to conquest from the northwest. In the case of Persia, however, at least one of the earliest descendants has a special significance in the history of Western civilization. 3 or 4 centuries before the Mongols, the Chelsea Turks, emerging from Central Asia, overran this path in an immense area of the land, which we may describe as of the 5 seas: Caspian, Black, Mediterranean, Red, and Persian. They established themselves as Kerman at Hamadan, and in Asia Minor they overthrew the Saracen dominion of Baghdad and Damascus. It was ostensibly to punish the treatment of the Christian pilgrims at Jerusalem that Christendom undertook the great series of campaigns known collectively as the Crusades. Although these failed in their immediate objects, they so steered and united Europe that we may count them as the beginning of modern history. Another striking instance of European advance stimulated by the necessity of reacting against pressure from the heart of Asia. The conception of Eurasia to which we thus attain is that of a continuous land, ice grid in the north, water grid elsewhere, measuring 21 million square miles, or more than 3 times the area of North America. While center north, measuring some 9 million square miles, or more than twice the area of Europe, have no availability of waterways to the ocean, but, on the other hand, except in the subarctic forest, are very generally favorable to the mobility of horsemen and camelmen. To east, south, and west of this heartland are marginal regions, ranged in a vast crescent, accessible to shipment. According to physical conformation, these regions are 4 in number, and it is not a little remarkable that in a general way these respectively coincide with the spheres of 4 great religions: Buddhism, Brahmanism, Mahometanism, and Christianity. The first 2 are the monsoon lands, turned into one towards the Pacific, and the others towards the Indian Ocean. The 4th is Europe, watered by the Atlantic rains from the west. These 3 together, measuring less than 7 million square miles, have more than 1,000 million people, or 2/3 of the world population. The 3rd, coinciding with the land of the 5 seas, or, as it is more often described, the Near East, is in large measure deprived of moisture by the proximity of Africa, and, except in the oases, therefore thinly populated. In some degree it partakes of the characteristics both of a marginal belt and of the central area of Eurasia. It is mainly devoid of forest, is patched with desert, and is therefore suitable for the operations of a nomad. Dominantly, however, it is marginal for seagulls and oceanic rivers laid open to sea power, and permit of the exercise of power from it. As a consequence, periodically throughout history we have here had empires belonging essentially to the marginal series, based on the agricultural populations of the great oases of Babylonia and Egypt, and in free water communication with the civilized worlds of the Mediterranean and the Indies. But as we should expect, these empires have been subject to an unparalleled series of revolution, some due to Scythian, Turkish, and Mongol raids from Central Asia, other to the effect of the Mediterranean peoples to conquest the overland ways from the western to the eastern ocean. Here is the weakest spot in the griddle of early civilization, for the Isthmus of Suez divided sea power into eastern and western, and the arid wastes of Persia, advancing from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, have constant opportunity for Ottoman power to strike home to the ocean edge, dividing India and China on the one hand from the Mediterranean world on the other. Whenever the Babylonian, the Syrian, and the Egyptian oases were weakly held, the steppe people could treat the open tablelands of Iran and Asia Minor as forward posts, whence to strike through the Punjab into India, through Syria into Egypt, and over the broken bridge of the Bosporus and Dardanelles into Hungary. Vienna stood in the gateway of inner Europe, withstanding the nomadic raids, both those which came by the direct road from the Russian steppe and those which came by the loop way to south of the Black and Caspian Sea. Here we have illustrated the essential difference between the Saracen and the Turkish controls of the Near East. The Saracens were a bunch of Semite races, essentially people of the Euphrates and Nile and the small oases of Lower Asia. They created a great empire by availing themselves of the 2 mobilities permitted by the land, that of a horse and camel on the other hand, and of a ship on the other. At different times, the fleets controlled both the Mediterranean, as far as Spain, and the Indian Ocean to the Malay Islands. From a strategically central position between the eastern and western oceans, they attempted the conquest of all the marginal lands of the Old World, imitating Alexander and anticipating Napoleon. They could even threaten the steppe land. Wholly distinct from Arabia as from Europe, India and China were the Turanian pagans, from the closed heart of Asia, the Turks, who destroyed the Saracen civilization. Mobility upon the ocean is the natural rival of horse and camel mobility in the heart of the continent. It was upon navigation of oceanic rivers that was based the Ptolemaic stage of civilization, that of China on the Yangtze, that of India on the Ganges, that of Babylonia on the Euphrates, that of Egypt on the Nile. It was essentially upon the navigation of the Mediterranean that was being described as the Thalassic stage of civilization, made of the Greeks and Romans. The Saracens and the Vikings held sway by navigation of the oceanic coasts. The all-important result of the discovery of the Cape Road to the Indies was to connect the west and eastern coastal navigations of Eurasia, even though by a circuitous route, and thus in some measure to neutralize the strategical advantage of the central position of the steppe nomads by pressing upon them in rear. The revolution commenced by the great mariners of the Columbian generation in down Christendom, which was widest possible mobilization of power, short of a winged mobility. The one and conscious ocean enveloping the divided and insular lands is, of course, the geographical condition of ultimate unity in the command of a sea, and of the whole theory of modern naval strength and policy, as expounded by such writers as Captain Mahan and Mr. Spencer Wilkinson. The broad political effect was to reverse the relations of Europe and Asia, for whereas in the Middle Ages Europe was caged between an impassable desert to south, and under an ocean to west, and icy or forested waters to north and northeast, and in the east and southeast was constantly threatened by the superior mobility of the horsemen and camelmen. She now emerged upon the world, multiplying more than 30-fold the sea surface and coastal land to which she had access, and wrapping her influence around the Euro-Asiatic land power which had hitherto threatened her very existence. New Europes were created in the vacant lands discovered in the midst of the waters, what Britain and Scandinavia were to Europe in the earlier times, that have America and Australia, and in some measure even Trans-Sahara Africa, now become to Eurasia. Britain, Canada, the United States, South Africa, Australia, and Japan are now a ring of outer and insular bases for sea power and commerce, inaccessible to the land power of Eurasia. But the land power still remains, and recent events have increased in its significance. While the maritime people of Western Europe have covered the ocean with their fleets, settled the outer continents, and in varying degree made tributary the oceanic margins of Asia, Russia has organized the Cossacks, and emerging from her northern forest, has policed the steppe by setting her own nomads to meet the Tatar nomads. The Tudor century, which saw the extension of Western Europe over the sea, also saw Russia power carry from Moscow through Siberia. The eastward swoop of the horsemen across Asia was an event almost as pregnant with political consequences as was the routing of the Cape, although the two movements long remained apart. It is probably one of the most striking coincidences of history that the seaward and landward expansion of Europe should, in a sense, continue the ancient position between Roman and Greek. Few great failures have had more far-reaching consequences than the failure of Rome to Latinize the Greek. The Teuton was civilized and Christianized by the Roman, the Slav, and in the main by the Greek. It is the Romo-Teuton who in later times embarked upon the ocean. It was a Greco-Slav who rode over the steppes, conquering the Turanian. Thus the modern land power differs from the sea power no less in the source of its ideals than the material conditions of its mobility. In the wake of the Cossacks, Russia has safely emerged from her former seclusion in the northern forest. Perhaps the change of great and transient importance which took place in Europe in the last century was the southward migration of a Russian peasants, so that, where agricultural settlements formerly ended at the forest boundary, the center of the population of all European Russia now lies to south of that boundary, in the midst of the wheat fields which have replaced the more western steppes. Odessa has risen to importance with the rapidity of an American city. A generation ago, steam in the Suez Canal appeared to have increased the mobility of sea power relatively to land power. Railway acted chiefly as feeders to ocean-going commerce, but transcontinental railways are now transmuting the conditions of land power, and nowhere can they have such effect as in the closed heartlands of Eurasia. In vast areas of which neither timber nor accessible stone was available for house and road making. Railway works, the great wonders in the steppe because they directly replace horse and camel mobility, the road stage of development having here been omitted. In the matter of commerce, it must not be forgotten that ocean-going traffic, however relatively cheap, usually involves the fourfold handling of goods, at the factory of origin, at the export wharf, at the import wharf, and at the inland warehouse, for retail distribution. Whereas the continental railway truck may run directly from the exporting factory into the importing warehouse. Thus, marginal ocean-fed commerce tends, other things being equal, to form a zone of penetration around the continents, whose inner limit is roughly marked by the line along which the coast of four handlings. The oceanic freight and the railway freight from the neighbor coast is equivalent to the coast of two handlings and the continental railway freight. English and German coal are said to compete on such terms midway through Lombardy. The Russian railway has a clear run of 6,000 miles from Virbaal in the west to Vladivostok in the east. The Russian army in Manchuria is a significant evidence of mobile land power, as the British army in South America was of sea power. True that the Trans-Siberian Railway is still a single and precarious line of communication, but the century will not be told before all Asia is covered with railways. The spaces within the Russian Empire and Mongolia are so vast, and their potentialities in population, wheat, cotton, fuel, and metal are so incalculably great, that it is inevitable that a vast economic world, more or less apart, will there develop inaccessible to oceanic commerce. As we consider this rapid review of broader currents of history, does not a certain persistence of geographical relationship become evident? It is not the pivot region of the world's politics, that vast area of Eurasia which is inaccessible to ship, when antiquity lay open to the horse-riding nomads, and is today about to be covered with a network of railways? There have been and are here the conditions of a mobility of military and economic power, of a far-reaching and yet limited character. Russia replaces the Mongol Empire. Her pressure on Finland, on Scandinavia, on Poland, on Turkey, on Persia, on India, and on China replaces the centrifugal raids of a steppe man. In the world of large, she occupies the central strategic position held by Germany in Europe. She can strike on all sides and be struck from all sides, save the north. The full development of her modern railway mobility is merely a matter of time, nor is it likely that any possible social revolution will alter her essential relationship to the great geographical limits of her existence. Wisely recognizing the fundamental limits of her power, her rulers have parted with Alaska, for it is as much a law of policy for Russia to own nothing overseas as it is for Britain to be supreme on the ocean. Outside the pivot area, in a great inner crescent, are Germany, Austria, Turkey, India, and China, and in an outer crescent, Britain, South Africa, Australia, United States, Canada, and Japan. In the present condition of the balance of power, the pivot state, Russia, is not equivalent to the peripheral states, and there is room for an epipose in France. The United States has recently become an Eastern power, affecting the European balance not directly but through Russia, and she will construct the Panama Canal to make her Mississippi and Atlantic resources available in the Pacific. From this point of view, the real divide between East and West is to be found in the Atlantic Ocean. The oversetting of a balance of power in favor of a pivot state, resulting in its expansion over magic lands of Eurasia, would permit of the use of vast conditional resources for fleet building, and the empire of the world would then be in sight. This might happen if Germany were to ally herself with Russia. The threat of such an event should, therefore, pour France into alliance with the oversea powers, and France, Italy, Egypt, India, and Korea would become so many bridgeheads where the outside navies would support armies to compel the pivot allies to deploy land forces, and prevent them from concentrating their whole strength on fleets. On a smaller scale, that was what Wellington accomplished from the sea base at Torres Vedras and the Peninsular War. May not this in the end prove to be the strategical function of India in the British imperial system? Is not this the idea underlying Mr. Amory's conception of that British military front stretched from the Cape through India to Japan? The development of vast potentialities of South America might have a decisive influence upon the system. They might strengthen the United States, or, on the other hand, if Germany were to challenge the Monroe Doctrine successfully, they might detach Berlin from what I may perhaps describe as a pivot policy. The practical combinations of power brought into balance are not martial. My concentration is that from a geographical point of view they are likely to rotate around the pivot state, which is always likely to be great, but with limited mobility as compared with the surrounding marginal insular powers. I have spoken as a geographer. The actual balance of political power at any given time is, of course, the product on the one hand of geographical conditions, both economic and strategic, and on the other hand of the relative number, virility, equipment, and organization of the competing people. In proportion as these quantities are accurately estimated, are we likely to adjust differences without the crude resort to arms. The geographical quantities in the calculation are more measurable and more nearly constant than the human. Hence, we should expect to find our formula apply equally to past history and to present politics. The social movements of all times have played round essentially the same physical features, for I doubt with the progressive desecration of Asia and Africa, even if proved, has in historical times vitally altered the human environment. The westward march of empire appears to me to have been a short rotation of marginal power around the southwestern and western edge of the pivotal area. The nearer, middle, and far eastern questions relate to the unstable equilibrium of inner and outer powers in both parts of the marginal crescent, where local power is, at present, more or less negligible. In conclusion, it may be well expressly to point out that the substitution of some new control of the island area, though that of Russia, would not tend to reduce the geographical significance of a pivot position. Were the Chinese, for instance, organized by the Japanese to overthrow the Russian Empire and conquer its territory, they might constitute the yellow peril to the world's freedom just because they would add an oceanic frontage to the resources of a great continent, an advantage as yet denied to the Russian tenant of the pivot region.